Alexander took over, he raised an army, and he proceeded to attack the Persian Empire. And he just kept going, just kept going. And eventually his empire, the map of his empire is very similar to the map of the Persian Empire. He was enormously successful as a general. He wasn't so successful in establishing an empire that would last. And in fact, he reigned from a period of about 336 BC. Notice 200 years after the Persians arose, Alexander comes along from 336 to his death in 323, and that's the end of his empire. It split apart into four parts. And so those remainders of Alexander's empire continued to dominate, continued to call the shots throughout the Middle East. But they had lots of wars between themselves. Now, way over here is Italy. And of course, the major city of Italy was the city of Rome. And it, through a long, complex history, managed to get more and more powerful and began to dominate not just the Middle East, but the entire Mediterranean basin, from Spain to Syria, from Greece to Libya, all around the Mediterranean. The Romans were flexing their muscles. The Romans were starting to call the shots. So that in 63 BC, the Romans came in and conquered the country of Judea. It was sort of a change of name from Judah to Judea, and the Romans began to dominate this area once occupied by the kingdoms of David and Solomon, and now the Romans were ruling. They continued to rule. Eventually it became called, at first it was called the Roman Republic, but eventually it was called the Roman Empire, and it continued to dominate this whole area, far beyond this, into Europe and so forth, until about 400 AD. So a period of over 500 years that this powerful empire was the empire of this area of civilization. Now then, I want to talk just a little bit about some general principles that are just obvious. It's not something I dreamed up, but it's just obvious from looking at the whole situation. First of all, military power was, of course, necessary to have an empire. You don't just sit down one day and say, I think I'll have an empire. No, you better raise a big, powerful army, well trained and well led by generals in order to have an empire. And that was characteristic of all these empires we talked about. Along with this, there is a need for organizational genius, really. And you see this, especially in the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. You see this ability to govern vast lands and keep them in control, keep things tamped down from any kinds of rebellions, uh, raising taxes, uh, you know, managing to make all these lands under you ultimately benefit you and your little patch of land from which you started. And so organizational genius was important. A third factor, military power, organizational genius, and then cultural and religious dominance helped subdue people. Think about it. If you are stripped of the way you've always done things, the way you marry, the way you farm, the way you trade, the way you govern your little city or whatever, the way you tell your stories, the way you understand yourself, if all of that is stripped from you and now imposed upon you, is a new way of looking at life. And it all revolves around the the particular vision of that particular empire, then you are going to be ill-equipped to rebel. You're going to be ill-equipped to raise any kind of resistance to the empire. And so it was the cultural and religious dominance ultimately that created uh, a, a people throughout the empire that were willing to go along. They may not have liked it, they may have hated it, but they were willing to go along with the empire that was currently in power. Now, in the case of Judea, uh, there was what I call semi-autonomy at times. Hear me, not all the time, but part of the time, there was a semi-autonomy. And that began when the Persians overcame the Babylonians. And uh, Cyrus the Great was the leader of the Persians. And Cyrus permitted the Jews who had been taken into captivity and taken to Babylon, permitted them to return, and that meant their leaders, religious and civil leaders, returned to Judea and began to make a life for themselves, to make a life for the people, to provide some vision and insight and uh, something like what it had been hundreds of years before. And so it was that you find in the books of uh, Ezra and Nehemiah, especially in some of the minor prophets, you see reflections of what's going on in these in the semi-autonomous uh, kingdom or land of Judea. They didn't have a king, but they had a governor, and so they were able to rebuild their temple. They were able to uh, establish their priesthood, and so uh, the life was not great, but life was bearable in those circumstances. Now, it didn't always go on like that. one of the most far from that kind of semi-autonomy was the case of a ruler after Alexander. There was a family called the Seleucids that ruled Syria up in this area, and they generally ruled Judea. Now there was kind of a back and forth complex set of situations between Egypt and the Ptolemies and the Seleucids in Syria. But along came one of these Seleucid rulers by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, and people pronounce it in various ways. Antiochus Epiphanes, or something on that order. I just always said Antiochus Epiphanes. Do the best I can. He was determined to stamp out the Jewish religion. And so he actually, at one point, put a statue of Zeus in the temple and sacrificed a pig in the temple. Now you can imagine what that was like for the Jews. Everything they held sacred was being violated by this man. And as a result, a group of a family sort of raised an army and went to war against Antiochus Epiphanes. And this family came to be known as the Maccabees. And there are a couple of books that are not generally recognized by Protestants as sacred books, but they are honored for their history. And so that tells the story of the Maccabees and their revolt. And they won. They actually won their independence and held on to that independence until the Romans came in 63 BC and overtook the land of Judea. And that was the end of the Maccabees. It was the end of basically of that semi-autonomy. And what we just won't get into the details of what went on after that. But what you see here then are various extremes. You see semi-autonomy, things going pretty smooth. You see rebellion. You see even independence for a short time, and everything in between. But one thing that was a constant was it was life among the empires. Two Old Testament books, or really I should say three, but not so much Ezekiel. Ezekiel is more dealing with the causes and the religious scene in Jerusalem. But Daniel and Esther are two books that kind of tell that story. And they're marvelous books. And what you see is that despite the fact that these empires were all powerful, there still was a God. And there were still people who believed in God. And they at times defied the empire, at times cooperated with the empire, at times somehow were doing their best they could within that whole situation. And so you begin to get a picture of what life in the empire was all about. Now, I want to mention uh, three or four situations uh, that sort of illustrate all of this. One, we jump way ahead of the story into New Testament times to AD 70. In that time, there was a revolution in Jerusalem, and the Romans came and put it down. They didn't fool around when they put it down. They came in, and remember, Jerusalem had been rebuilt, the temple had been rebuilt, and it had been rebuilt in a grand fashion by Herod the Great. And so the Romans came in and they just leveled the city and the temple and killed many, many people. It was a slaughter. What happened? You don't mess with Rome. And these people paid the price. Now then, there also were those who managed to defy the empire to some degree, and the Lord protected them. You may have heard the story that is often titled The Three Hebrew Children in the Fiery Furnace: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I won't elaborate on that, but they were three men who refused to knuckle under to the religious demands of the empire. And they were thrown into a fiery furnace, but survived by the power of God. Another individual friend of these three was Daniel, who did basically the same thing. He defied the empire, and he was thrown into the den of lions. And he survived because of God. And then we have the story of Esther and her uncle Mordecai. And Esther and Mordecai managed to save the Jews from slaughter by the empire, by the wise use of Esther's beauty and her influence with the emperor. So we have this contrast of all sorts of situations: winning, losing, terrible disaster, great success, all sorts of things taking place, with one reality going on throughout all that history. It was life among the empires, I should say. Okay, thank you for watching. This concludes third grade Bible. We're going to kind of switch gears in fourth grade Bible, talk more about theology and the bigger picture of the Old Testament. We won't be able to get everything said, but we want to kind of get a more religious perspective on the Old Testament in the fourth grade. So I hope that you're able to continue to watch the Bible K through 12. Thank you.